Okay. Well, I'm here because I met Katie and Joel just a few weeks ago, and they helped me with a shoot. I met them. I learned all about their film. I showed them an essay that I wrote kind of on a whim a few years ago, and Katie liked the essay. She published it and asked me to come and be here tonight with you. So I'm going to start with what's in that essay. I'm just guessing nobody's seen it. It's called The Fractal Geometry of Consciousness. Or Why Crop Circle Hoaxers Must Be Tibetan Monks. That's the name of the essay. So the idea that I had was that I could write something that actually maybe was a plausible explanation of what crop circles really might be and how we can think about them without having to call them done by hoaxers or whatever. So that's where I started with the idea, just because crop circles are so amazing. They're incredibly mathematical, and it belies my sense of how things are done, that you could actually make one of these things as a human being could do it in the dark, in one night, without anybody being able to notice you. It seems to me if we were really going to do these things as mathematically precise as they are, we'd need a computer graphic artist and maybe a week of time and a lot of careful measurement, and these things are just appearing like that, right? So that's the mystery of them. So I started with this book, which I learned about when I was in 10th grade geometry class, called Flatland. This mathematician wrote this novel in which he imagined a world in the second dimension. And if you live in the second dimension, the characters are named a square, a circle, and what happens in the story is that they learn that there's an unimaginable to them third dimension. They can't imagine what a third dimension would be like. And so that's kind of the core idea that sets up what the essay is about and what the talk is about. So I made a little animation to try to help figure this out. What you're going to see here is a 2D plane and a 3D plane, and you're going to see a sphere passing through the plane simultaneously. Okay, so the idea is if you live on the plane, as the sphere is passing through, all you're going to experience is a cross-section of a moving circle in time. It'll start out, when it's not touching it, you can see it could be nearby, but if you lived in the second dimension, you wouldn't have a clue. And I'll run it again. When it makes its appearance, it's like a magical event. Out of nowhere, it makes an appearance. It would grow, and then it would shrink as it passes through, and then as it stopped making contact, it would disappear. So the whole thing would have the appearance of a magical event. So using that as the analogy, what if there's more dimensions from 3, is where I started to think about it. And I brought in the idea from string theory. Now, I haven't done math since high school, so it's not like I really know what I'm talking about. But string theory is a way that physicists are trying to describe the nature of reality at its core using mathematics. And they talk about a possibility of maybe 10 dimensions that make up the whole fabric of reality. So nobody can prove it for sure, but you can talk about it mathematically. So I'm thinking, okay, Flatland, the analogy, maybe string theory is a way to think about other dimensions beyond 3, and connecting that together with fractal geometry. I don't know if you guys are too familiar with the subject, but it's a really fascinating subject that was figured out pretty much in the 70s and 80s. And now we have incredible images from it, because fractal geometry is the way that you describe nature. It's the way that computer graphics artists can draw the forest in Madagascar, not like Disney did back when they did Bambi, but they just program in some mathematics and it grows the forest. And fractal geometry basically does a really good job of explaining how nature works. This whole main concept is self-similarity. It's a scalable idea. If you have a piece of broccoli, and you look at the whole broccoli, and you tear off a piece of the broccoli, the little stalk of broccoli looks like the big piece. That idea you can carry through just about anywhere in nature, and you can talk about biology that way. This is a representation of lung tissue, and this idea of scalability and fractal self-similarity is a way that you can think about the complexity in biology. So fractal geometry turns out to be a really great way to model physical nature. And here I have one brief animation, 30 seconds. You're going to see what's called the Mandelbrot set, named after the mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot. It's this funny little shape. And then the animation starts, and essentially mathematical calculations are creating the images that you're seeing, and you're going to see how it takes you into the image. That's the simple formula that just gets reiterated over and over. That's the Mandelbrot set. And there it is again. Now this video goes on and on and on and on for minutes, and it's mathematical calculation. So it's revealing something really profound and really amazing about the nature of reality, beyond where we could even really model it rationally. But that's what fractal geometry has done for us. This has given us a tool to really comprehend so much about the nature of physical reality. So I put all those little ideas together. Flatland, string theory, fractal geometry, and I thought, well, could you think about consciousness using fractal geometry the way that you use it to think about nature? Could you speak about creativity as having a fractal dimension? You know, we do wonder at the awe of nature, and it always looks very creative to us, but we don't really have the tools to try to imagine how it is that you can see this creativity when you don't see what the creator is, so to speak. So what if it's just a dimensional thing? So that's essentially the idea that I had, to imagine that what these crop circles are. Another way to think about it comes out of metaphors from our own technology. We got 3D printing now. We've had our computers for a long time. Before anybody hits print on a 3D printer to make something in 3 dimensions, they have to design it in software. So the software is another dimension from the 3 space that we live in. And so in that sort of a way, it made me think, okay, maybe crop circles are like that. There's this kind of mathematical message in the image that's from perhaps one of these string theory dimensions, but where perhaps there's some kind of intelligence. And that's what we're really looking at, is this mashup of an intelligent form of communication that's passing through from one dimension to another, as if by magic. Using that metaphor from being on the 2nd dimension, how it would be impossible to understand something going otherwise. So that's essentially what the essay is like. And of course, here you can see how this is one example. This is all very fractal mathematics. Any crop circle image you're going to see is going to be like this. And then, of course, here's another one that I find very interesting. The phi ratio, the golden section. This is also another aspect to nature, to reality, that you see over and over and over, all through life, all through biology, and certainly all through art. So look at this. This is the same shape. This is the sunflower seed. You have this impression in the cornfield in a matter of seconds that shows up like this, and then you have it, you know, here in nature, the way that we see it more regularly. And, well, you know, so it's like in the cornfield, it's like it emerges out of nothing. And that word emergence is very important to where we're going with this talk right now. So this looks like flying over the swamps of South Georgia into my hometown of Jacksonville, Florida, where you see all the water and all the tributaries and all the branching. But this is actual fractal geometry. This is just an image from the mathematics. But this is can really show you how things in nature are fractal. So moving on from what that essay was about, with the freedom that I have tonight with you guys, Katie and Joel inviting me to speak, I thought, well, what can I talk about that kind of picks up on what that idea is like? And I have this book, comes from 1998. It's an interesting little series on science that's kind of like a graphic novel. You turn the pages, the language is simple, there's some clever graphics that goes with it, explaining these complex ideas. So fractal geometry is a part of chaos theory and a part of complexity theory. It's all sort of really tied together. It's kind of where things are really on the cutting edge these days. This is kind of the way that it's all set up. You can see that this is Benoit Mandelbrot, the guy that invented it. They're explaining fractals in here. And on this page right here, you have talking about how the second law of thermodynamics, which says that the universe is winding down, doesn't really quite do it all. That there's not all systems tend towards disorder or entropy. And this little lady is down here saying, nature contains deep order, which is believed to emerge naturally. So that word emerge is actually a term from physics. And it's about emergent properties. You can find this in the language of physics. It's a way in which you can go to Wikipedia and find out lots and lots and lots about it. But it's the idea that reductionism hates because you can't just back time a complex emergent phenomenon like a life form or other aspects of physics and break it down to its starting core components. The whole idea of emergent behaviors, you can't predict the outcome from the simple components at that simpler level. And this is what we see again and again and again in nature, is emerging complexity out of simpler levels that can't be predicted if you try to play the whole meme backwards. And so just at the base of that little image that I was showing you is where I turn and I see the conflict. New variables occur over time and do not require an outside force in order to be. I'm not sure what that is. I think I know, but down here, this is not a problem for physicists. It's more of a problem for biologists because it appears to contradict Darwinian ideas, because it's not about random behavior and being able to predict things from just the reductionism of the chemistry and the physics. And so biology is uncomfortable with emergent properties, but physicists are confident that is very much a description of reality. So I'm picking up on that conflict because every good story needs a conflict. That's how it always works. So I'm going to make the rest of the talk an exploration of what it really means to be talking about emergent properties and how biology is not comfortable with it. So I get a bulletin in my email every morning from this place called Science Daily, a little list of things to read about. They're all little one-page stories that are culled from science journals, where the official publications are going on when people are making their breakthroughs. And I came upon this one very recently. Physicists discover inorganic dust with lifelike qualities. So this is a very weird story where these physicists are working experimentally with what they call plasma, which is the fourth state of matter. And they're working with dust, inorganic dust, so chemically speaking, not a part of the makeup of biological life. And they observed an unusual quality. Under the right conditions, particles of inorganic dust can become organized into helical structures. These structures are autonomous, they reproduce, and they evolve. Inorganic dust in a plasma, forming helixes. Particles in a plasma can undergo self-organization. This effect results in microscopic strands of solid particles that twist into corkscrew shapes or helical structures. All right, I have another animation to sort of try to illustrate what this sounds like. I owe these two animations you're seeing here to Gary Telfer, who's a computer graphics artist I met recently. Right? Okay, so out of inorganic dust, self-organizing itself into the shape of a helix, and then with that, the ability to reproduce. So the physicists are looking at this, and they're concluding, the researchers hint that perhaps an inorganic form of life emerged on the primordial Earth, which then acted as the template for more familiar organic molecules we know today. Well, maybe, but what they don't mention that I see, maybe you guys see it, is that helix shape is the shape of the DNA molecule. And the DNA molecule does all of the things that they're talking about. It makes copies of itself. It can evolve. It can reproduce. And so that's what comes up for me is when they say, could this be life? What they're actually noticing is this is what DNA does. That's why that thought is coming to them. That's more plausible to me. But so just continuing here with the story, here's another one from Science Daily. This has a date on it of April 2015, okay? New study hints at spontaneous appearance of primordial DNA. So here's a different story. The self-organization properties of DNA-like molecular fragments 4 billion years ago may have guided their own growth. What this is about is the actual origin of life on planet Earth. The first bacteria appear about 3.5 billion years ago, and they are fully formed as life. And they have the DNA fully functional, working at that earliest stage of life. Jeremy Narby has said that DNA is the most sophisticated nanotechnology that we could ever aspire towards. It's 10 atoms wide, and you can't have anything smaller than that and actually perform a function. So this idea here is to say, the struggle that biology has had because of reductionism is to try to imagine how do you get a complex molecule like the DNA molecule through random mutation, and the notion that neo-Darwinism has about how evolution has proceeded. And they thought, well, maybe there's a simpler way where the piece of the RNA, which is a part of the messenger system, a part of the way the DNA does its work, maybe somehow a simpler version out of the organic molecules that were starting to accrue before really life was there. Maybe that's how it came to be. And they had to abandon that idea because they realized that there was no way you were going to get the complexity that the DNA molecule represents through that RNA system, through random behavior at the earliest origins of life. So here's this new story in which the new findings suggest a novel scenario for the non-biological origins of nucleic acids. So here's where we say what the DNA molecule actually is. It's a language. It's the language of life. It has 4 letters that mean nothing until they are paired with other letters, which make the words, which set up the whole way in which proteins are formed and how the genome decodes for the various life forms. And of course, we've always assumed that you get molecular biology, you get organic molecules before you get life. And here comes physicists pointing to biology and saying, it looks like that the ability that DNA has to self-organize could have happened in an environment which was not biologically molecular, but inorganic. And so if that pans out, because this is very, very, very new, there's a method by which they can imagine how life actually formed on Earth. The new findings suggest a novel scenario. They're saying, hey, maybe the DNA molecule really is around before the bacteria 3.5 billion years ago. So those two stories bring us to a place where it appears that from the headlines of science, we can now talk about the origins of life in which the DNA molecule as a language is fully writ at the moment of the simplest life forms. So, okay, bacteria is super simple. Viruses are even simpler, but that DNA molecule, that ain't simple. It's really, really cool how complex it is and, you know, how amazing it is. So, going forward with just this story, here I have a 2-minute animation. This is what's, unlike the 2 animations I've just shown you done by an artist, this is what's called scientific visualization. This is when you program computers mathematically and ask it to show you something that your eye can't see. So this is a scientific visualization done by scientists to say this is how the DNA molecule copies itself and makes copies of itself. So let's just watch this 2-minute animation.
Using computer animation based on molecular research, we are now able to see how DNA is actually copied in living cells. You are looking at an assembly line of amazing miniature biochemical machines that are pulling apart the DNA double helix and cranking out a copy of each strand. The DNA to be copied enters the production line from bottom left. The whirling blue molecular machine is called helicase. It spins the DNA as fast as a jet engine as it unwinds the double helix into 2 strands. One strand is copied continuously and can be seen spooling off to the right. Things are not so simple for the other strand because it must be copied backwards. It is drawn out repeatedly in loops and copied one section at a time. The end result is 2 new DNA molecules.
I love it how they put industrial factory sounds behind that animation to give you the idea, here's the factory where this is being done. And it blows my mind to think that this helicase is unspinning the molecule at the speed of a jet engine. And this is all going on inside of every single cell of every single life form. Again, the width of a DNA molecule is 10 atoms. In the case of the human genome, the length of one DNA strand in every cell of the human body is 2 meters. So you have a 10 atoms wide by 2 meter long strand of DNA in every single one of your cells. Jeremy Narby said that's like a finger that stretches from Paris to Los Angeles, to try to visualize what we're really talking about here. Okay, so emergent behavior, crop circles. We need a way to talk about this. DNA forming before life is here. It doesn't fit with the way that reductionist neo-Darwinism tries to describe how everything has come to be. Well, here's Simon Powell. Maybe some of you guys have had a chance to read his books or see him online. He was in New York about a month ago. That's actually when I met Katie and Joelle. They helped me interview Simon Powell back in Manhattan. I wanted to just put a conversation down in which he could tell me about his work. This is Darwin's unfinished business, the self-organizing intelligence of nature. Simon Powell is taking the theory of evolution and he's putting a new interpretation on it. He's not challenging what it does, but for instance, he's saying natural selection doesn't just proceed randomly, it's looking for sensibleness. And evolution proceeds with that idea of sensibleness assisting the thing as it moves along. So let me just give you a 2-minute version of Simon Powell describing how he talks about natural intelligence.
The natural intelligence paradigm argues that evolution is a naturally intelligent process that builds together naturally intelligent systems of biologic. But I don't think it's a conscious intelligence. I think intelligence can be in an unconscious form, and then a conscious form of intelligence can arise or emerge out of that. So my work is about the natural intelligence paradigm. What provoked me, well, my psilocybin experiences obviously provoked me, because I kept seeing if I was out in an oak forest in a bee mushroom state, it was clear to me that the ecosystem, the various organisms, the trees and the plants on the ground, and the insects scuttling around, I could see very clearly and directly that life was an intelligence, rather than copper wires and microchips and all this kind of thing. It's made of organic chemical cycles and proteins and enzymes and this kind of thing. But I would see again and again, and it was an overwhelming impression that life was a kind of intelligence. But again, the problem is that we associate. If you think about intelligence, technology, design, it's always associated with us. We're one of the most arrogant, big-headed species to walk the planet, and basically mankind has its head up its own arse, and so we're loath to attribute intelligence to the rest of nature, particularly the whole system of nature that fosters the emergence and evolution of life. So my crusade, if you like, is to promote this paradigm of natural intelligence and to find ways of making the case, strong, watertight ways of making the case that life is an expression of natural intelligence. It's not like the intelligence is outside of nature. It's that the whole system of nature, in terms of the laws of nature, which are very specific, the forces of nature, which are very specific, the building blocks of nature, which are like Lego bricks and are very specific, that is a naturally intelligent system, one function of which, if you like, is to foster the emergence of life, biospheres, and eventually nervous systems that can facilitate consciousness. And I think that's when natural intelligence begins to wake up and become aware of itself and become conscious.
All right. Brief thing from Simon Powell. I recommend his books, and he gives very good talks. You can find him on YouTube. So I wrote this down thinking about what my takeaway from Simon Powell is when he tries to describe what the heck is natural intelligence. So I'm saying evolution is thinking itself into existence. It's making it up as it goes along. It's this internal process somehow that we're actually observing. So that's kind of the idea of natural intelligence. And so this is where it all closes up. Emergent properties is something biology is not comfortable with, but physics is. And it seems to me, if we take Simon Powell's notion of natural intelligence and we say emergent properties is intelligent behavior, now you've got an explanation for crop circles, now you've got an explanation for all these different things that we're talking about if we assume that Simon Powell's new paradigm of natural intelligence, a reinterpretation of Darwinian evolution, is a way to think about what we can see happening in nature around us, including these crazy anomalies like crop circles. All right, so I'm bringing this now around to a close and pulling it along full circle with one last story. This acronym CRISPR, Clustered Regularly Interspersed Short Palindromic Repeats. I just love it the way formal science comes up with these almost impossible to pronounce frames. This is a description of an anomaly that biologists found when they were studying a bacterium that's 3.5 billion years old. They found a strand of DNA within the DNA of the bacteria that didn't belong to the bacteria. And it was separated by spacers that are palindromes. That's like a word that's spelled the same way forwards and backwards. So these spacers, which are pieces of DNA that are palindromes, is holding a virus DNA inside of itself as separate from the rest of the bacterial DNA. All right, so when they saw what this was and tried to figure out why it was happening, they realized that the reason that the bacteria is storing these pieces of virus is because it represents a previous encounter with the virus. So it's a way that the bacteria can recognize the virus if it should encounter it again. And it can send out a strand of RNA that can target that virus because it knows the DNA code since it has it stored. And it can send out with it this enzyme called Cas9. And the Cas9 enzyme cuts out the virus and sends it on its way. So this is a form of immunity based on memory in the bacteria. And the molecular biologist who teaches Introduction to Biology, The Secret of Life at MIT, I took his course online, he's very involved in all this, and he's calling it a form of memory. I think I might have said just now intelligence. The idea is that the DNA molecule, the DNA of the virus inside of the bacteria, its presence is a form of memory. So you have memory in a bacteria happening 3.5 billion years ago at the very, very beginning of life. Okay, so here's a new story filling out CRISPR. The reason that CRISPR is really on everyone's mind these days is not just because they made that observation. It is because about a year ago, in biotechnology, they figured out how to take the technique that the bacteria has for highlighting a specific strand of DNA and dispatching it with the Cas9 enzyme. They figured out how to do that through biotechnology to any life form. Now, human biotechnology can take the trick of the bacteria and the Cas9 enzyme. It can manufacture synthetic RNA and target any strand of DNA in any life form. down to a single nucleotide. And when it does it, it's editing the DNA genome. It can pass this on to future generations. It's not just related to the one individual. So this is a huge marker at this moment in biotech. There are patent wars going on. Capital has been raised. There are companies busily at work. And the Pulitzer, well, the lady who shares in the patents, she's at Stanford, recently issued a warning. We shouldn't be doing this with the human genome. We don't really know enough yet to really say we can do this. And 2 weeks later, I read that the Chinese had, in fact, done an effort to explore the human genome using this technique. And they failed at whatever they were trying to do. So this is happening. And this new story kind of fills it out just a little bit more, how a bacterial cell recognizes its own DNA. We see how it takes the virus DNA, but how does it recognize itself? And the way it frames the story, the first challenge of the bacterial immune system is to detect the difference between foreign and self. In other words, to detect the difference between self and not self. Now, this is something we would ascribe to any higher life form. It's the nature of identity at a certain point to have that. And here we are saying that at this level of a bacteria that it has to detect self from not self. Again, you have biologists who don't want to say that any of this stuff is really intelligence as we're used to thinking about it. They're using the language, they have to because this is what they're observing, that you normally use when you're assuming intelligence associated with it. They're using even anthropomorphisms, which is supposedly a taboo as well, in order to explain what's being observed. So the materialistic science that's grounded in the physics of Newton has been incredibly successful at describing nature, but it's brought us to this moment where its own paradigm is collapsing because of how much information it's been able to brought in and how many anomalies it can explain. That's why I'm excited about Simon Powell's work and how these breakthroughs are showing up. So this is just a quick little blurb that explains how biotechnology can basically copy the way that the bacteria does this. And this is a story from Nature, which is all about the new companies forming and the phenomenon of it is, in the realm of biotechnology. And this is my takeaway. If you go from the bacterium, the Cas9 ability, and then you scale up that ability of that bacteria such that now human beings, humanity can do this to any genome and any life form. Well, that to me is another example of what I was thinking about when I wrote out that essay called The Fractal Geometry of Consciousness. Scalable sentience. So we see what the bacteria does, and now we're scaling it up to our level, and we have a broader way of seeing it. So I'm suggesting that this recent phenomenon kind of supports this idea of thinking about intelligence as something that, like fractal geometry explaining physical nature, you can explain metaphysical nature. So I see it as closing the loop. And that's basically bringing me around to the end of my little talk here. And I noticed that since I wrote this essay in 2002, and I'm still talking about it, and we've got these new stories breaking news that, maybe the phrase scalable sentience will catch on. And if it does, well, you heard it here first. And this is where we kind of started the conversation, these amazing crop circle images, which you can find in lots of places these days. Fractal geometry explains what you're seeing here. That's the part that's really amazing. And in my talk just now, I've used fractal geometry to talk about crop circles, and I've taken us down to the molecular level of a DNA molecule. I've gotten as small as we can get. But what about if we go in the other direction? Rupert Sheldrake, a scientist who's in Joel and Katie's movie, likes to speculate on a taboo in science. He likes to speculate on whether or not our sun is sentient. And he as a scientist, says, this is a serious thing we can think about. And he carries it a little bit further. He thinks, well, what if our sun, our star, were sentient? What would it think about? Well, it would think about its own kind. So if that were the case, and suns, stars are sentient, what does that make a galaxy? So you get to the idea where you can take scalable sentience out into the higher and higher levels of cosmic organization. And so I'm going to close here by letting Terence McKenna have the last word. I interviewed him in 1998. You might say that's kind of where this whole my being here and talking about these subjects began, because I thought I was going to be making a film with him about his ideas about novelty theory. But it turned out that the interview I did was the last one that he did before he was diagnosed with his brain tumor. So I ended up with this interview, which I finally published on Reality Sandwich a few years ago. And this very last question that I asked him, I said, do you think that the Milky Way galaxy is a sentient being? And this is his answer.
So the whole entire Milky Way galaxy is a being?
Well, it's an organism, yes. And the galaxy is a kind of an organism. You can think of it as a fractal resonance with a cell. The galaxy has a nucleus of very dense material where very mysterious processes are going on. Then it has a cytoplasmic envelope of stars and gas clouds that surround that core. And then it is an individual, very distinctly defined by the vast emptiness that lies between it and the next galaxy. Yes, I think nature builds by fractal intent, and that all organisms have a core and then a deployed surround, whether we're talking about the cell, the solar system, the Earth, the galaxy. In the process of the conservation of novelty, structures are created with cores that are more complex than their outlying neighborhoods. To my mind, a galaxy hanging in space is a picture of the time wave. Every star is a data point in an enormous computer simulation of the novelty wave. That's why it has that spiral structure. You know, scientists are very puzzled that the galaxies don't fly apart. They don't seem to have enough mass that their gravitation should hold them together. And there's been a lot of talk about dark matter or some missing factor. Well, the missing factor is novelty. The galaxy stays together because the galaxy wants to be a galaxy. In other words, it wants to hold on to the level of novel morphology that it has achieved. It has an actual appetite for expressing itself in that form. That's why the galaxies are spirals. And in a sense, those spirals are very large pictures of the time wave where we can at last see it not confused with its background or foreground. So everything organizes itself fractally, spirally, with a dense center in its spatial domain and a dense center in its temporal domain. We are like this. Galaxies are like this. Planets, stars, bird flocks, coral reefs. But in the case of the galaxy, it's particularly easy to observe the structure because the thing is so huge that its forces dominate and damp out other forces which might distort it.
Thank you. So that's fun. Thank you very much. And I know we have lots more entertainment here. So I'm happy to move on however anybody wants to do it. But if you'd like to have a bit more conversation and ask a question, what the heck? Whatever Joel and Katie are thinking.
I have a question. Wow. Wow. Where does that leave us in terms of like, does your research bring you to CERN's activities out there in Europe? Well,
that's essentially where they've got that big collider and they're trying to figure out whether or not we're a single universe or whether we're a multiverse. And they're There was that movie out just a couple of years ago that tried to chase that down. I know about this stuff in a broad, general way. I'm a filmmaker. We've all had a lot of experience in this room where we're interested in exploring the boundaries of our consciousness. So I've always been drawn, I realize this, I've just been drawn towards science and towards the effort at explanation about what's really going on. And I really can't answer it, really beyond that question. I'm aware of its work, but that's what I really love about McKenna, what I wanted to show that last piece when he says the galaxy wants to be a galaxy and that's why it holds together. You're not going to hear that language at CERN, that kind of language of intent. Or you're not going to hear about scalable sentience as a way to think about it. It's all purely the purest material physics. But the notion seems to be they're just going to keep working on it, and sooner or later this language is going to percolate up and be part of what the paradigm is concluding.
Are you seeing the merge of people like McKenna and?
Well, in a way, I see it like that only because maybe you remember a couple of years ago there was this moment when the TED Talk people took off a talk that Rupert Sheldrake and Graham Hancock had given separately, and Sheldrake's new book is all about anomalies in science, and they took him down, Ken Jordan over at Reality Sandwich wrote an essay about it. He goes, this is all about the boundary where scientific materialism refuses to consider the way that its own model is being exploded by the information it's gathering. So that left me with this question, which I think motivates all the talks that I give these days. What paradigm follows scientific materialism? That's the effort to answer the question. So playfully I say, in the future, the scientists will think like the shaman. Jeremy Narby's work, where he went and met the Japanese scientist who put a slime mold in a maze, learned from the Japanese scientists that just because they come from a Shinto background of an animist tradition, that idea of putting a slime mold in a maze and calling it intelligence is not hard for them. But the Japanese scientist told Narby, because of the Judeo-Christian tradition, you have separated mankind and the idea of intelligence from the rest of nature. And the Pope's encyclical is all about how we cannot interpret ourselves as being dominant and nature is here for our disposal. We are part of it, not the other way around. So in trying to answer the question, what paradigm follows scientific materialism, it just feels to me like this thing that Narby locked onto, but now it's in the front page of the New Yorker magazine cover story for Michael Pollan, The Intelligent Plant. They're talking about intelligence in nature at the plant level. And the information is just percolating up, and it just seems to me that it's just a matter of time before Eric Lander at MIT is talking to his young students, many of whom might be future Nobel laureates, and they're saying, you know what? We got to call it what it really is. We need a new generation to tweak the model just a little bit. So, is it going to happen? I don't know, but it just seems to me like, as we probably all feel like we understand, if we just continue inexorably going forward with this notion of technology that masters and conquers nature, we're doomed. So, humility and these other aspects that come from more traditional ways of knowing tied to this amazing ability at the nano level to design things. Human beings are doing so much now. We got to grow up to go with what we have learned how to do. And I think that's the idea. How do we get beyond scientific materialism?
Now, my understanding might have some restrictions just because of the way my education has been delivered. I'll acknowledge that. I'm curious with, I'm very stimulated by fractal emergences we see through the natural world. I constantly seek out that stimulation, like just seeing that pattern over and over and over. And I'm wondering, you mentioned like a DNA allele chain being found prior to our like bacterial renders, and I'm wondering what just maybe to understand that more, how that was, what form that was found in. Is that more like crystalline, chemical, or like?
Well, this story that I, just breeze through here is a story from this science journal where the physicists conducted an experiment in a way that in which they could see that DNA could self-organize in an inorganic environment, and that gave them the idea that this could be a way that that DNA came along. See, so yeah, now they can say we know it self-organizes, and now we can see that it can happen in an environment that's not organic. So now you can have a chronological explanation of how it could be, the DNA molecule could be present before organic molecules actually start forming, and so that life can come together. But the mystery is how the heck it all happens. And there's no answer for that. It's just the observation that you can't get the DNA molecule to work the way it works by trial and error. It's a language, and it doesn't work until all of its components are there. And as we know, these 4 simple words have created such amazing diversity. And it appears as though it's, a form of intelligence that is manifesting as if by magic out of thin air. That's why I show you that first animation with the 2D and the 3D, to give you the notion of what a magical event seems like to us, maybe only because the limited nature of our senses doesn't allow us to see all of it all at once. Maybe you've had that experience where some of those barriers go down and suddenly you see a whole lot more. And you can't walk around in that kind of a frame of mind. You just have to take the lesson and then, come back down. So, but I didn't do math after high school, and I just became interested in these things. And the beauty of the time that we're living in now, like I'm saying, you can go online now and take college level courses for free. Pick a subject you're into and go for it. It's really cool. All right, man. Scott, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to make an observation. So the question is to when the paradigm changes, like what does it take, to change a paradigm? If you're familiar with Thomas Kuhn?
Yep, Structure of Scientific Revolutions.
So I read the first version in the 70s when I was in college. And if I recall correctly, based on, historical observation, until the present, he would make the case that it would change when the existing paradigm failed to answer or failed to come up with very practical solutions, practical things. Let's say, curing cancer or something like this, right? And when that failed and a different approach succeeded with very tangible practical results, that this would be the beginning of a scientific revolution where people would then readily abandon what they had clung on to for so long.
But he also says that these scientific revolutions happen with a new generation turning over. And, I think about that a lot, especially with stories about young neo-Nazis or something like that. It's really hard to look in the mirror after a lifetime of work and say everything that I've always thought that I knew is wrong. That's a hard thing to do, and most people just don't do it. And what Eric Lander, the guy who teaches this 10-week survey course in the history of biology, he gets going early on in the course by saying, biology in the 20th century is way more interesting than physics in the 20th century, and here are the stories. And he starts you out essentially telling you about breakthroughs in biology, often by people who went to MIT, and got the Nobel Prize. And he comes to a beat again and again, as weeks go by, where he says, and everybody was complacent, they thought they'd figured it all out, and then along comes somebody from the next generation who asks a new question. And then he has another little beat as he tells the tale. We'll say the question get asked, how do they figure out the research? Well, they go to the expert. And the expert is always bacteria. So Eric Lander is pointing to what Kuhn is pointing to, which is expect the younger generation to remodel the paradigm. And so I'm just waiting for Eric Lander, who's way in on CRISPR and knows all this stuff, to begin to say, or to have one of his students who could be in this room right now go back and say, you know, I've read this guy and seen this, and it seems to me we ought to be talking about intelligence at these levels in a different way than we're used to. You know, it seems close, but stay tuned. Okay, well, let's maybe keep the show running. Thank you very much again.